Hi everyone. I'm here to review this book, The Education of a Value Investor. I loved this book. In 2022, this book had the biggest impact on me in terms of educating me with skill sets towards building wealth in a much more sustainable way, packed with wisdom and focused on building not just wealth, but also an enlightened path where you actually actualize yourself and you become a better person. So this is huge. You get to learn a lot. The title talks about value investor, but there is also education in terms of enlightenment. I felt there's lots of wisdom packed in. So let's get into it. Yeah. So those are the three goals. And the first chapter is named From the Belly of the Beast to Warren Buffett. Right? So this book is all about his journey. It's Guy's journey. And he's starting off with, where he started his first job right out of Harvard Business School. It was a snake pit is what he compares it to. And he says that it was so hard to work there and so toxic of an environment that he felt that even being 1,000 miles away from that work would have been too close. So he talks about his workplace as how he started his career and why he picked that role. He picked it primarily to look successful from the outside because he could envision himself as someone who made this huge deal in the first 18 months of leaving Harvard Business School in an alumni newsletter. And I could so relate to everything he shared because he was so authentic. I could see him being vulnerable and sharing the truth in the most vulnerable way. And I couldn't have come across a better book which I could relate to as well. So there's lots of things here. So he starts off his journey from a very toxic work setting. And he quickly realizes that he doesn't always he will never make a decision which will optimize for his outer success or the look and feel of the outer success, but actually the inner success. And that's where, while he was working there, he came across a book by Warren Buffett. There was a library, a bookstore, where he accidentally picked up The Intelligent Investor and the Buffett book, The Making of an American Capitalist. And he felt that the principles and philosophies that Warren Buffett had were so much in alignment with his values. Because at D.H. Blair, his current job, he was taught that clients are like marks to be exploited, not served. But with Warren Buffett and the two books that he read, he found hope. He found hope that there is a better place to work, there's a better way to work, and based on principles. So that's how he started. He valued the book primarily because he knew how bad it could get with his current work. The second chapter is the perils of an elite education, right? So Guy Spier first studied at Oxford and then eventually at Harvard, the two most prominent schools. And he starts off in the early parts of this chapter with this line that really resonated with me. He says, "I am so well educated and yet did not have the common sense or the moral courage to get out of D.H. Blair instantly." And he says, pause and think about it. This should be a big reason of concern. Look at the self-awareness, right? And he says, did my education fail me or did I fail my education? These are his lines. And this is where I deeply connected. And I said, I'm going to read this book end to end, right? And I started taking notes as well, starting this chapter. Because here's this guy who's super successful, runs a massive fund, and he's so vulnerable and sharing the truth in the most raw form. And people can relate. I could relate. I have made super big mistakes as well, right? And I could relate to lots of things that he shared. So he says in this chapter, which is focused on elite education, a lot of times, in our school, we get to optimize our effort around the marks that we need to get, or the scores, and the assignments, the due dates, whatever professor says, gets done. And we get to do lots of rote learning. And not all schools or not all subjects or not all classes make you think critically and question the status quo. And so paying too much importance to the outer scorecard, which basically, by that he means something that emphasizes what is visible outside, or the marks that we get, the grades that we get, or whatever is on the outside, is something as a byproduct that happens when we go to school. We need to question the status quo. We need to think critically. We need to learn practical skills and not just theoretical skills. And he says that it's important not just to get into a really good school, but to get into a program that matches your needs. That was another important piece, because he got into Oxford, where he had to learn law, and he hated it. And at some point he got so frustrated that he knew deep down that this was not working. So he had this realization at school, which was the feeling of knowing something versus actually thinking something. And he realized that he needed to follow his bliss. He needed to follow what he felt was the right thing. So he actually, changed his subjects and then eventually pivoted. So don't pay too much emphasis on elite education alone, because that's not sufficient. Not every school will make you question the status quo. At Berkeley, that's one of the core principles: question the status quo, right? Leadership defining principles. And so it's important to know about the downsides of elite education, right? Which is, it emphasizes on getting things done on time. There's a specific template. You score the highest, people optimize eventually. I was guilty. In my undergrad, I focused a lot around how to optimize for getting the best of scores. And I figured it out. I started off failing the first year and eventually did really well at the very end. So it's something you can figure out, but not necessarily that means that you're really good at the skills that you've acquired. You could figure out how to get the best of scores, but that doesn't mean that you are actually good. You might have a shining resume at the end of it, but that doesn't mean that you actually learned the skills. So focus on really gaining those skills. That was my key takeaway from this entire chapter, right? Like, focus on gaining those key skills. Build your critical skills of thinking critically, questioning, and opening your minds to practical learning. The next chapter, it's about my first steps as a value investor. So he started off with getting introduced to Warren Buffett via a book, right? He quickly realized that did his education fail him? Yes. Did he fail his education? Yes. Both were yes, right? And then he had some learnings from reflecting at D.H. Blair. But then he wanted to take the first step. And the saying goes, when the student is ready, the teacher arrives, right? And so he started taking the first step as a value investor. And that's chapter 3. And the key learning for him was he started learning from everyone and from everything. And Tony Robbins was the first one that he got introduced to via a common friend, where he learned that he needed to get out of his own way and take the first step. And so he took the first steps. He got inspired by that talk, and he actually got his second MBA. So first MBA was Harvard Business School. The second MBA was when he reread all of Berkshire Hathaway's annual reports and started mirroring what Warren Buffett would do. Figured out what companies he invested in, read their annual letters, and he quickly realized that he needed to continue taking those steps that he learned from Tony Robbins. And he figured out who he needed to spend time with and wanted to start off his journey as a value investor. He interviewed many places, but he realized that his formal education had led him to a dead end, that no one wanted him for this next job because of a massive failure at D.H. Blair. But he had his savior, his father. So his father seeded him with the first $1 million, and eventually his father also recommended several of his colleagues to invest more with his son. Eventually very quickly he had, I believe, $15 million. So he finally felt like he was doing the right things that he was born to do. So you remember that feeling when you do something and you totally enjoy it. Like, I'm enjoying creating this content for you and sharing this. And he really felt that he was doing something he was born to do. That was his first few steps. He started learning from everyone, reread all the Berkshire Hathaway annual reports, and started his fund from his apartment in New York. And so that leads to the next chapter, the New York Vortex, right? So he started it in the most frugal way in New York from his apartment complex. But eventually the New York atmosphere got him, right? He was advised by the people that he surrounded himself with to have fee structure that was like 1% annual and 20% profits beyond 6%, if I believe. That was not what Warren Buffett did, and he didn't follow the ideal standard that Warren Buffett did, which is no fees, no annual fees, and 25% profit beyond 6%. But he just followed experts, and the environment had a huge impact. And that was the one major thing that he believes was not that ideal. And then envy, greed, fear took over him in many ways. He started marketing, competing, and sounding more impressive compared to his peer hedge funds to gain AUM, assets under management, and started doing what others were doing. And got himself a huge office space, a fancy Bloomberg terminal, hired a COO, analyst, high-powered lawyers. And so those are all the negatives of the New York Vortex, as he calls it, being in New York. But he did one thing that was really good. He joined the value investment club, where he realized that even Roger Federer has a coach. And Warren Buffett, keeps like-minded people like Charlie Munger around him. And so he wanted to surround himself with the right people. And so over there he met Joel Greenblatt and many other value investors. And those sessions in the Value Investment Club in New York really helped him. In that club, they dissected ideas and debated, asked open-ended questions, and they got better as value investors together. And so he quickly realized that that environment had a huge positive impact on him. And so he wanted to build something better for him in the future. So that was New York Vortex. The next chapter is meeting the master. So while that one thing worked really well for him in New York was the Value Investing Club, he'd also gotten a copy of a Charlie Munger talk, which was 24 Standard Causes of Human Misjudgment. And over there, he found out about writing thank you cards either from this book, Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, or from that talk. I don't remember which one, but he started writing thank you cards to express his gratitude. And he wrote like 3 cards a day, which is insane. Like if I had to write one a week, it would be awesome. So that's a huge learning as well. He started writing thank you cards, and those thank you cards eventually reached Monish Pabrai, because he had attended one of Monish's talks from a recommendation from his analyst. And Monish replied to him saying, hey, you're the only guy who replied and said thank you. And so the journey towards surrounding himself with good people like Monish started. And so I feel I should also write a letter to Guy saying, hey, I loved this book. I'll probably do that. I will, as soon as I'm done recording this, I'll probably send him a link, see if I can share my thanks by doing that. But yeah, so he started writing thank you cards. And with that, he got introduced to Monish. And then Monish got him introduced to Warren Buffett. We all know they did a lunch with Warren Buffett auction participation together, and they won the auction. They paid close to $600,000, and he learned a lot from Monish. So that Monish had a huge impact on him. They built friendships together. They met several times, and he learned lots of practical skills from Monish. And I have a full video on Monish Pabrai from the Richer, Wiser, Happier books. If you want to know more about him, absolutely a must read. And I'm going to get Monish's books next and read that. And he learned about idea of cloning from Monish. He learned about deduction of foundation eventually. And then they built a good friendship together and ended up having lunch with Warren Buffett. $650,100, approximately that much, right? And that was huge, right? Like here's the opportunity for him where he gets to actually have lunch with Warren Buffett. He was just reading his books, right? And he was like, this is the person I want to meet. And they end up winning that lunch. So the next chapter is all about like the lunch, right? And I have 3 parts for this: preparation for lunch, at lunch, and post-lunch experience and inspiration, right? So in preparing for lunch, he had already done a lot of homework. As I told you, the first few steps that he took in chapter 2 that he shared, he'd read all the Warren Buffett letters. That's a lot, like at least 600 pages. And he'd read not just those, but also the companies that he's invested in and their annual reports. So he'd done a lot of work as to understanding how Warren invests. He had visited Omaha 12 times, and most of the times he's woken up 5:30 in the morning to line up at the South Gate for the Berkshire Hathaway annual conference. And he currently also holds 30% of his investments in the Aquamarine Fund in Berkshire Hathaway. So he's done a lot of work to prepare. And the thing that I liked from this chapter was he says, if you're going to do something, it's best to commit to it with your whole heart and do it fully with the best quality, best effort, right? And that was the huge learning. So he'd done a lot to prep for that lunch for 12 plus years, right? He had been prepping a lot. And so now he had the opportunity to have lunch with Warren. And at lunch, he finds Warren Buffett. And he finds him to be a person of no pretenses, no stuffiness, very lighthearted, who appears to be who he is from the inside and is the same outside. And Warren had come prepared. He'd come prepared with giving more than the value of the lunch that they had paid. And he learned a lot at lunch. He learned about lots of practical skills. One of the things that he shared was who you marry and choosing the right person to marry is the most important decision. Well, both Monish and Guy had already married, but luckily Monish's daughters got a good tip at that time. And then helping others was another key area that they got really inspired because all of this foundation, all of this charity money for this lunch was going to go to a foundation. And so Warren was doing that not for himself, but for helping someone else. He learned about inner scorecard and importance of inner scorecard at lunch and the perils of debt and many other things. He's just shared some of these things, but he learned how Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger are this rich because they were not in a hurry to get rich. They knew they were going to get rich, though slowly they were compounding for many years, and they were in the best of their health. Warren Buffett is like 91 today and Charlie Munger 98. They're still going. So they had lots of time to double their investment returns. So that was the lunch learnings. He just shared a few things. I also just shared a few that was written in the book. Not everything is covered here, but that was, he felt that he got more than the money that he paid. So just imagine all the things that he learned at lunch. And post-lunch, he was inspired. He was inspired to help others. He was inspired to build a better environment for himself where he could make rational decisions. He was inspired not to beat Warren Buffett, which is what his initial thought process was. How can I beat this guy? He was inspired to be the best that he could be, the best version of himself. And he was inspired to actualize his life versus optimizing gains in his lives. That was a huge learning, right? All of these learnings and inspiration were huge. So lunch with Warren Buffett, massive. So prep, at lunch, post-lunch, we covered all of that. Next up, he's also shared his learnings from the financial crisis, right? Lots of learnings. He's experienced several of them from the Asian crisis of 97, dot-com crisis of 99, the World Trade Center attack, 9/11, 2008, financial crisis. And he's seen his funds go down, top tick, bottom tick, 30 to 50%. And so he has seen these market cycles of optimism, euphoria, depression, pessimism, right? And the key takeaway from here is be prepared to invest and build the temperament, the emotional quotient. Don't just build the intellectual quotient, but also build your EQ, the temperament, so that you can buy when everyone else is selling. He says buy when there's blood on street, meaning when everyone's doing redemptions of their funds, you should be investing because that's the best time to invest. And these crises have cycles. They follow market cycles. So everything becomes gloomy at that time. There's lots of knock-on effects that he calls. He was even worried about his broker being bankrupt. Well, I've not thought about that, which is what happens if my broker becomes bankrupt, right? I don't know, what happens if Vanguard or like some of my Fidelity funds actually become bankrupt, because that was the situation he was going through. So he understood how to become more resilient and emotionally better. And he had never taken any debt, so that really helped him, because not taking debt is a huge key learning that he had learned from his father, where eventually you could get forced to do things that like liquidate your house if you can't pay your mortgage, liquidate your shareholdings if you margin trade and you can't meet the margin requirements. It could be pretty huge to not take debt. So lots of learnings from the financial crisis, the role of debt, and how he learned from his father, because his father was the biggest investor in his fund. If he had done the redemption at that time in 2008, he would be out of business. And so he realized that he was standing on the shoulders of giants, in his words, right? And so that was a huge win for the father to have had that kind of trust in him. And so he quickly realized he needed to build a structural advantage to handle crisis. So he wanted to spend time studying, modeling his heroes, figure out like what would Warren Buffett do if he was going through this crisis. wanted to quickly build the best environment where, these low quality information doesn't muddle his thinking. And he wanted to figure out a constant source of cash flow so that he could constantly invest independent of market cycles, because these cycles keep happening. So that was his learning from the market cycles, right? Next chapter, he shares some of his wisdom on how he is going to go about creating that ideal environment. And he shares why it's super important to learn about how the human brain works. That's important. And how behavioral finance and neuroscience has a huge impact on us. So that was key learning. Understanding how your brain works, and that it has two parts. The slow part, which is the rational neocortex, and the fast part. Fast part as in the fast decision-making part, which is subrational and instinctive. And our fast part of the brain actually makes up lots of decisions. And so everything in the world outside, our brain reconstructs that reality for us. And so if our sub-rational part of the brain gets stimulated to make decisions that are suboptimal, then we would not be able to invest wisely. There's a reason why we have these two parts, and it's important to learn about how our brain works, because then we can become better investors. And so our environment had a huge impact, is what he realized, because we cannot use our brain to override the brain. So he wants to create an environment where, his brain is not subject to constant barrage of distractions, disturbing forces that can exacerbate his irrationality, right? If you're constantly looking at a stock price movement and constantly trading, that's the fastest way to get poor, right? Because it's very difficult to beat the market in the long run. And your brain, he shared this anecdote which was really powerful, which is it runs on a 12-watt power, which is like 1/5 the power of what's needed by a 60 watt bulb, right? 1/10 actually, yeah. So 1/5 to 1/10, yeah. So it's important to realize that there are these shortcuts that the brain has built, and you need to use your brain in the most effective way. Yeah, with 1/5 the power of a bulb, if your brain has to make so many of these decisions, it's going to be hard to make the right decisions all the time. So your environment has a huge role to play. And then your role models, figuring out like how would your role models behave and how would they make a decision where to live, what to surround yourself with, is important, right? And he shared one other wisdom, which is the things that we learn in business schools, the economic models, right? The Black-Scholes model, the Keynesian model, all of these models have very novel and ideas that are really good to work under pretty big and elegant assumptions. So you can't use them as is, right? Like the efficient market hypothesis, right? There are lots of those things that make you feel that you know something, but actually you don't. And so it's very important to create the right environment, have the right models that actually work, not just in theoretical, but also practical, because real life is messy. And he shares this other piece, the last piece, which was, it's easier for him to make a rational decision in a mundane place, and so rather than in a stimulated place, because in a stimulated place where there are these emotions of greed, envy, and fear, our fast brain gets activated and overrides the slow brain. So creating an ideal environment is super, super critical. That was the key learning. Makes me think, I live in San Francisco in the middle of all the technology startups and all the big companies. It's a huge positive source for me. I get to learn with so many of these people, but I have to think, am I surrounded in the right setting that I need to be from an investment standpoint too? So that gets to the next chapter, right? So he's actually, I think, moved to Zurich from New York post this book. And so he's actually implemented what he shared in the book. So that's a huge act of courage to move to a new place. And primarily he wants to do this so that he can tap dance to work, which is the topic of the next chapter, right? And he feels that if you take care of yourself, your whole self, and if you're non-investing life, your health, your family, your time you want to spend in your hobbies, your sports that you want to play, if you can do all of that, then you can actually make a better decision. And if you can spend some time in quietude where you can think, meditate, and take care of yourself, then there's a chance that you can tap dance to work. There's a reason why Warren Buffett is in Omaha. He's not in New York, right? So that was his key insight from this. And to really tap dance to work, you have to go beyond the survival mindset, which is what I learned in this chapter. A lot of times we do things because there are lots of external constraints. Some of us may have legal constraints wherein, if you're an immigrant in the United States, if you're an H-1B, you can't do a lot of things. If you want to, let's say teach on the side, you can't do it. You can't, if you want to, but there are lots of things you can do. So you need to really quickly figure out what is the creative aspect in you that you want to foster. Like, I like teaching technology. I like teaching business school courses. I like doing book reviews. I like to help people at scale to learn skills to practically improve their lives. That's what I'm doing with this video too. So being able to do that and escaping the survival mindset is the first step. And then being able to spend quality time with your mentors, your friends, your family, your children, your parents is important. Because if that life is taken care of, that part of your life is taken care of, then you can actually make good decisions. And you also need like-minded friends who, in this case, if you want to be a better investor, you want really good like-minded investment friends who support each other, in a environmental, in a emotionally good environment. And then life becomes like a game. So that was the key insight, right? He started playing more sports. He became more authentic. He had more time because now he's in this place, Zurich, where not many people get to meet him. Only those that really care about him come to meet him. And he's able to spend more time and energy doing what he likes best, investing. And then in chapter 10, he shares really good details about what are some of the tools that he uses for investing and how does he make that process of investing better, right? And he strongly believes that if you have a tool set, an effective set of rules, let's say, then you can actually make investing a rule-based, in some sense, that guides you from not making the same mistakes over and over. So he shared some of the processes, and the 8 key ones from this rules were: number 1, do not check stock prices as frequently as possible. I'm guilty of this. I check it quite often, and this recommendation or this rule is based on a really sound psychological learnings, which is the losses that we suffer make us feel the pain twice as much than the same quantum of pleasure. So if you lose $2 on a $100 stock, it feels 2 times worse than gaining the same $2 when it goes from 98 to 100. So every day checking the stock price is a really terrible idea. So he has rules around how to minimize this and only invest in those companies where, let's say you invest today, the stock market is closed for 5 years. Would you be okay with that? And he doesn't buy things from someone who tries to sell him things. Right? He just doesn't do it. And the third piece was, don't talk to management. He thinks that the CEOs are highly skilled salespeople and they can make everything sound positive. They are skilled at that. So it's better not to clobber your judgment by talking to management first. And gather the information in the right order. So he strongly believes that the first thing that enters the brain tends to stick. So he wants to start with the most objective things like the annual reports, 10Ks, 10Qs, the financials, proxy statement, footnotes, and then eventually go into the earnings transcripts, press release, announcement, if there are books about a company and things like that. And so it's remember, it says, the quote says, don't eat your dessert before your vegetables. The same thing. He wants the right information first, right? So he shared some of these principles with us, and these are very valuable. The fifth one that he shared was, don't share your investment ideas other than with people who doesn't have any axe to grind, meaning who doesn't have anything to gain from you. Because if they do, then they'll not ask you open-ended questions. They'll not make it better for you. Instead, it will be a judgment call and you'll be biased. And never buy stocks in an open market. He makes buy-sell decisions when the market is closed, and then he gives the order, and then he gives a range, and then the sell order happens, because he thinks it's very hard to control the brain and the emotions. If the stock tumbles by a lot, once you buy it, don't sell it for 2 years. That's another rule. It makes you slow down, because in stock market, the more activity you have, the worse it is for you. So you want to slow down and reflect on why you made certain decisions and actually stick with it and be with that decision. And that'll also force you to not invest more than what you can afford to lose, right? Because your quantum will be small, because now you've said, I'm not going to sell it. And then don't talk about your investments publicly, because things change, your information changes, and you might regret certain decisions or commitment that may bias you, because there's commitment and consistency principle, and you'd want to feel consistent even when you want to change your mind. So those are some of the rules that he shared for investing, and he's built a better process over time. And he goes into much more detail in chapter 12, where he goes into the checklist as to how he uses a set of checklists from a book called Checklist, which I think inspired this chapter, where a surgeon wrote that book. I'm blanking on his name, but this is Survival Strategies from a Surgeon. So using checklists is really important for memory recall, because it helps us avoid repeated mistakes. And investing is like flying an airplane. There are lots of things can go wrong, and you don't want to miss out on checking certain things. And a checklist is the best way, where you can check if you should invest or not invest. There's a checklist for that. Check if you should exit. There's a checklist for that. Check if you understand the company fully well. There's a checklist for that. So you can build a checklist for any decision that's important. And you can build it by analyzing your investment mistakes that you made in the past, what you can learn from it. And he shares this specific investment tool of a checklist and some ideas that he learned. And so one of the key pieces before he makes an investment is he checks whether the company management, anyone in the management team, is going through any personal experience that's a difficult one, because it radically affects their ability and to execute at work and impact shareholders. Is there a win-win for the entire ecosystem that the company focuses on, like Costco or Amazon? Or is it like certain stakeholders are impacted in a much negative way, then he just avoids them. And then invests in company where there's a strong hold of the value chain, right? Because if it's outside of the control, if a large part of the value chain is outside of the control of the company, then they could be vulnerable. So these are some examples he shares with a specific tool of a checklist in chapter 11. And then finally, he's sharing what are some of the people aspects of doing business Buffett Pabrai way, like Monish Pabrai and Warren Buffett, right? He thinks that you should hang out with people who are better than you, because then you cannot help yourself but improve and be like them, right? And avoid people who are too hard, meaning from 100 people, there will be 10 people that it's an obvious, yeah, these are the best people you want to hang out with. There'll be 10 that you know obviously not the right kind of people you want to not hang out with. But there'll be 80, which is, you don't know. He's saying just ignore the 80 as well, like the 10. Just too hard. Don't have the time. The 10 is enough, right? So who you do business with, what kind of people you hang out with, and those people who don't necessarily always have a hidden agenda are the right people to hang out with. And have this attitude of giving, and giving. Just giving more than what you get. Because once you give, you already receive in the act of giving. Like, look at all of the things that Warren Buffett's doing with pledging all of his shares, most of his shares actually, in Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Monish Pabrai with Dakshina, right? And be the person you are from the inside as on the outside. Right? Gives you a lot of feeling of lightness, I feel. So that's doing business with people and being the Buffett Pabrai way with chapter 12. And chapter 13 is the quest for true value, which is the last chapter, where he gives some insights about how markets work and how some of the key takeaways, the last key pieces of wisdom. And in terms of markets, there's always going to be fear, insecurity, biases, people making insanely huge amount of money sometimes. And the financial markets are super merciless when it comes to exposing our emotional weakness. So he says that the ultimate downside is to ask yourself, like, once you make this investment, can you bear the downside of it? And if not, start only investing that much that you can average out. Learn from the mistakes and reflect regularly every year. What were those mistakes for the market? And true value is when one goes beyond. This is the pieces of wisdom. True value is when one goes beyond accumulating money for money's sake or wealth building sake, but when you go beyond money, beyond professional advancement, beyond social admiration, and you go from the outer success to being successful in the inner and being happy on the inner, where you are more self-aware and you have the opportunity to make decisions that are internally consistent, and you have your supporting group out that supports you, the mastermind group that supports you from the decisions that you make and helps you think through some of the biases, and that you pursue your inner growth journey. This is huge. Being in tune with your inner voice, being in tune with what you need, being in tune with being who you really are with no pretenses, listening to your inner voice, will make you better prepared for the inevitable adversities that life throws. And so give yourself the gift to become the best person that you can ever be. That's the final message of this book, and I absolutely loved it, right? There are lots of follow-ups that I have, and I'll share some of that in the screen here. So there's this 24 Standard Cause of Human Judgment by Charlie Munger. Absolutely watch that. This document is in the link of this video, so you can watch some of these. And this video from GUY SPIER on the 1% show is phenomenal. Like, I've listened to it so many times. I'd highly encourage you to listen to that. And you can even follow his investments. It's all available online on this site called Data Roma and Aquamarine Funds. You can see where he's invested, what percentage. He's also been very generous with the books on his website that you can check out on Aquamarine Funds. And there's more, right? So that he shared in that fund. So in essence, read this book. This is an awesome book. I learned a lot. If you know GUY SPIER, tag him. I wish he sees my gratefulness through this video, and buy his book. It's worth every penny. It'll at least give you 100x of your return by just reading it.